This video is going to show how to make a bar graph on Excel that includes multiple sets of data. So what we have here, these are relative standard deviation values that were determined via measuring the average and standard deviation of repeated water measurements using different types of analytical glassware. So we have repeated measurements using a volumetric flask and repeated measurements using a volumetric pipette. And then those replicates were done at 10 milliliters, 25, and 100. So these are the relative standard deviation. The idea is for us to be able to compare to see how the relative standard deviation changes as we change our delivery volume. So the way to create this bar graph, so we're not going to have any error bars here because for relative standard deviation, we don't have any error bar. So what we're going to do, again, whenever we're making a plot, we want to leave our upper left-hand corner unlabeled. You want to leave that empty, or sometimes Excel will do something you don't want it to do. So you want to, as a kind of a rule of thumb, anytime that you're making a graph or a plot using Excel, you want to leave that upper left-hand corner open. So you're going to click and select all the data that we have here. We're going to go up to Insert, over to our bar graph. We're going to add a 2D column here, and you can see here that we have all of our data represented. So on the x-axis here, we have our 10 milliliter delivery, 25 milliliter delivery, and 100 milliliter delivery. And then we have a legend here that defines our two different groups, with blue being our volumetric flask and orange being our volumetric pipette. Okay, so right here we have all the data that we need. So now it's all about formatting. So if you already watched one of my previous videos on formatting, you can end this video now. If not, keep watching to see how to properly format. So when we're formatting, we want to make sure that all of the axes are nice and black and bold, and so they're very easy to see by the eye, and that we don't have any unneeded information. And so for me, since we usually include captions with all of our figures and graphs in our lab reports, we don't need to have a chart title. That's actually redundant information. So I will click that chart title and delete it. And also, I think that the individual grid lines within the chart are also unneeded as well, so I click and delete those. Okay, we can expand this box a little bit so it's taking up the entire space. So now we want to make sure that our axes are easy to read. So we'll click, so we left click there onto our axis to highlight our y-axis. We're going to right click, go down to Format Axis. That's going to open up our formatting box here on the right. So when we're over here in our formatting axis box here, we can see that we can adjust our axis bounds if we'd like, and we can also adjust our tick marks and our numbers. So we can see here that we have 4 different decimal places here when it's really not necessary. So we can go down, click number, and we can either adjust the decimal places here manually, or we can just choose general. And so what general will do is that will choose the smallest possible number to convey the information. Okay, and then we'll also want to go up to tick marks, and we're going to include our major tick marks on the outside. The next step we'll want to do is we'll want to make this graph nice and black and bold. So again, when we're formatting our axis, we'll go over to the paint can over on the side. Solid line, we're going to make that black, and we're going to make this a 1.5 font, so it's nice and thick. The next step is to make these numbers a little bigger so they're easier to read. So if we go to Home, I always change this to size 16, and I make the font black. We're going to do the same thing here on the x-axis. We're clicking our x-axis. If we already have the Format Axis box, we can jump right over. If not, you have to right-click, go down to Format Axis. We're going to go over to our Format Axis options over here. We're going to take our tick marks, and we're going to put our major tick marks again on the outside. And then we're going to go to our fill in line, and we're going to change the color to black, and then we're going to change our thickness to 1.5. And that is again for our line. We have a solid line. And then now we'll want to change our text here again to size 16. And then we'll make that black so we can see it. Now we want to take our legend up here, make sure this is nice and readable. So we'll change that. I usually change that to size 14, and then again to black color again. We might need to change the size a little bit so it's formatted nicely, and then want to locate that legend so it is out of the way of the data. The last thing that we want to do to format here is to include an axis title for our y-axis. To do that, you're going to, again, click on the graph. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see this plus sign for chart elements, and then we'll want to include axis titles. So you can see it shows up an axis title for both the x and the y-axis. In this case, we don't need it for the x-axis. We can delete it. Let's make a little more room here for the y-axis label. And then we can click our axis title, change that to size 20, change the color to black, and then we can change this to relative standard deviation. Okay, and then we can adjust our size of our graph here so that the label looks nice and clean. Okay, again, the size 16 and size 20 that I use, that's just a personal preference. You can choose whatever size that you'd like to make the graph look nice and presentable. So once you create this graph, if you want to copy this to an additional set of data, what you can do is you can, when clicking on the graph, you can right click and go Save as Template. And then so you can input this as a straight bar graph. And so previously on a different video, I showed how to make a bar graph with error bars. This is a bar graph without error bars. So we can just call it regular bar graph and save. So that way, if we have an additional set of data, so if I copied these data again, so Control C copy, and then right click, if I paste this as numbers, we can then, if we highlight all these data again, insert bar graph. If we right click, change chart type, templates, we can now see if we choose the bar graph that we just had, we can see that all of our formatting is retained in this new graph. All we have to do is update the relevant information, move some things around a little bit, and it saves us quite a bit.